Okay. Am I recording? Yes, it appears that I am. Welcome back to Humanities. Hi, I'm your host, Jack Parr. No, that joke probably, no one's gonna get that joke, but that's okay. You don't have to. I got it, and that's good enough for me. Um, I should have had it hosted by one of the stuffed animals. I could hold it up and lecture. You could bring me Dr. Womber, and I could show them the plague doctor. I did mention the plague doctor, if you've been keeping up with the videos. Ha! That's a test. Not like a test you're going to get graded on, but yes, Dr. Womber, the stuffed plague doctor, will be your host today. Isn't he adorable? From squishable.com. I'm not actually shilling for Squishable, but it's just a cute little thing. So anyway, all right, what are we talking about? Oh yeah, and High Middle Ages. The High Middle Ages. Okay, two videos ago, we talked about the Dark Ages. Last video, we talked about the High Middle Ages and the transition from the Dark Ages to the High Middle Ages to the 11th century miracle. So the High Middle Ages lasts then from the dawn of the 12th century, that is the beginning of the 1100s, up through arguably the end of the 15th century, the end of the 1400s. Some people still classify the 1500s as maybe late medieval, but I think we're fully into the Renaissance by that point. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But in any case, this period from the beginning of the 12th century on up through the about the end of the 15th century is what we can call the High Middle Ages. So the 1100s, 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, about 400 years. And in it, what we see are is the unraveling of the various elements that made Europe paradigmatically medieval. The feudal system and its attendant lack of public institutions is beginning to unravel, which is to say that monarchs are beginning to develop functioning bureaucracies, first made up of layers of nobility, sort of a haphazard, an ersatz bureaucracy made up of the layers of nobility, the subinfugation of society. Then you get the common practice of court nobles that really don't have any land that they hold, but their entire support comes from hanging around at court and doing some job at court, basically running some element of the government. And then finally, a professional bureaucracy that is not made up of nobles at all, but simply of technocrats, professional functionaries that do the job of running the country. So public institutions are making a comeback. The church achieves a position as a sort of pseudo-public institution by unifying its organizational structure across Europe, across Christendom, the land of all, sort of, that is to say, the area that encompasses all believers in Christianity. It sort of manages to unify itself organizationally with responsibility to the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. So that's another public institution. The development of a middle class. So one of the key elements of the feudal nature of early medieval society is that there are the people who are the lords, the ones who own the land by right of conquest and by right of violence, and they allow the vassal farmers, the peasants, peasant literally just means someone who works with the land, the peasants to live on their land and to be protected by them, but in exchange they have to give them some of their agricultural product. That was the social order. Because there wasn't much of an urban population, there was not much in the way of crafts. Whatever crafts were practiced were cottage crafts at best, and you don't have a lot in the way of advanced craftsmanship or artisanship or anything like that. But as we get into the High Middle Ages now, trade is reviving because Europe is becoming more calm, because the church is able to act in a capacity as a kind of public institution and intervene to stop a lot of the violence, or at least mitigate it. Also, kings are becoming more successful at creating stable, large domains in which they can enforce their will, which also mitigates violence within those. So yeah, centralized governments are emerging, and the church is emerging as a public institution. These act as counterweights against the anarchy and violence of pure feudalism. So peace is coming on the land. As a result, people can travel more easily. As a result, trade is taking place. As a result of that and the increased agricultural bounties that came in the 12th century, urban populations are on the upswing. When you've got urban populations, what have we learned? You get artisanship, you get specialists, you get craftspeople. And so we see people who are not peasants, they don't farm the land, but they're not lords. They don't own any land. They make their money off of specialized trades, either off of creating things for trading or by facilitating the trade itself. And these people start to become quite wealthy. They form a powerful class of individuals that has no place in a purely feudal order. These people don't fit. What does trade require? Well, trade, look, if your whole society is just based around people growing food, and then some other people with weapons try to take that food, while still other people with weapons try to stop them from taking that food, well, there's not a lot of need for, like, rule of law and courts and stuff. You're not going to sue the guy. That guy tried to steal my food. I'm going to sue him. You don't sue the marauders with swords. You hope the other guys with swords kill them. That's how it works. But trade, contracts of goods to be delivered, of when they will be delivered, payment in kind or in coin, in installments or all at once, upon delivery or with a down payment. These things need to be enforced. You need law. You need some kind of regulation. And at first, obviously, in the early part of the High Middle Ages, the middle class was relying upon what rudimentary forms of justice were done in the courts of the nobility. But this is an inconsistent way of getting things done at best. This kind of rule by fiat is not conducive to trade. This is why, incidentally, autocracies, pure autocracies, are bad for trade revenue. So anyway, when the rule of law is subverted, when there is no rule of law, trade suffers as a result. So there was a hunger and need for public institutions, this new artisan class, this class of people who were neither nobles nor peasants, but who were nonetheless wealthy and therefore powerful, cried out for laws, courts to enforce them, basically the rule of law, this very humanistic way of approaching social organization that we saw in classical Greece and in Rome, but which sort of fell out after the in Europe after the fall of Rome. So, the things that made the Middle Ages medieval, feudalism, going away, right? The idea that society is organized around personal contracts with an attenuated or entirely absent public sphere, that's going away, in the process of going away in the High Middle Ages. Bureaucracies are being developed. The rule of law is being revived at the University of Bologna in North Italy, where they still had access to many, many documents and books of Roman law back from the Roman imperial times. They studied those books and tried to formulate them as a basis for civil law in Europe. Public institutions, rule of law coming back. Because trade was reviving and this merchant class, this artisan class was becoming wealthy, you have a total, let's put it this way, the wealth in Europe in feudalism is based entirely on land, right? Coinage was not used a super lot. When it was used, it was silver coinage. And most payments, especially from peasants to their lords, from vassals to their lords, were payments in kind of agricultural good. That was the coin of the realm, if you will, land. Now the problem with land as the basis for wealth in a society, we're going to get into a little abstract philosophy of economics here, but stick with me. The problem with land is that it is a strictly linear function holding technology constant. Without changes in technology that would allow you to extract greater agricultural product from the same amount of land, then the amount of wealth produced is linearly and directly proportionate to the amount of land that you have. And there is a strict upper limit to the amount of wealth that can be produced based on the amount of land that you can successfully hold. That's it. There's only so much wealth to go around. There's only so much buying power, if you will, in all of Europe on a strictly feudal system. But as we get these anomalous traders and merchants and artisans, these people who don't fit properly into the feudal system, as they come in, then we get a new source of wealth. Agriculture still forms the basis of wealth. It is at the bottom of the economic system. Everything kind of grounds out in that. But what you have is the ability to take raw goods and by finishing them with skills of artisans, you can turn them into things that are worth much more than they were before, potentially vastly more than. The economics of art and objet d'art and things like that are very, it's a very slippery field, but the whole concept is that you can, there's almost no upper limit, right, to how much wealth can be produced by trade. It becomes a matter of the velocity of money at that point, because these objects can change hands. So imagine, to illustrate this, imagine if all of my buying power is based upon how much wheat I'm growing. I have a bunch of wheat. Here's what I can do with that. Right? I can buy a new cow or maybe a new hat, what have you. The wheat might change hands a few times, but it has a very limited duration on how many times it can change hands. And it probably won't change hands more than once. I'll give it to my lord, some of it, and the rest of it I'll use to maybe sell, what have you, in exchange for goods and maybe some different kinds of food. But then I'll consume that food, and they'll consume the wheat, and it's gone. And that's it. But now, so the amount of labor I put into it, it has sort of a one-time purchasing power, and then it's gone. But imagine you put your labor instead into crafting a fine set of silver candlesticks, and you trade those to someone else for something. The person who uses silver candlesticks, unless they are very strange indeed, is not going to eat them. These silver candlesticks can be held onto and appreciated or traded to somebody else. Right. And that person could at some point trade them to somebody else. The value, in other words, produced, does not vanish out of the economy and arguably increases in value. And the same thing, having been produced, can be the basis of any number of trades, rather than just one, or maybe two trades at most. So without bogging you down in economic theory, you're just going to have to take my word for it that artisanship and trade, and especially the extension of credit by merchant companies, as would happen in the later part of the High Middle Ages, these things literally added wealth into the medieval economy. They literally raised the overall standard of living, the overall level of wealth totally in the society. Now, as it happens, the vast majority of that wealth flowed upwards to the nobility, because they held on to their position in the early Middle Ages, in the Dark Ages, through dint of being professional warriors, people with both the skills and the equipment to make war in a society that was entirely structured around war. But now we have a society where warfare is not the only or even necessarily the primary way of addressing things. So how do those nobles fit in? Well, one way that they fit in is by trying to claim some other basis for their supremacy. I touched on this in the last video. Right? And in the High Middle Ages, we see a transition in the literature of the meaning of nobility, nobilitas, being rather something you did and something you are. Blue bloods and so on and so forth. So, okay. So this is the fundamental structure of medieval society is becoming less and less medieval. A couple of cultural institutions or innovations, however you want to put that, sort of accelerated this trend. And let's talk about those. One of them was the development of the university. Okay, so the university, as we know it, of course, is higher education, right? And the medieval model of education should seem a little familiar to us. Before the university came along, if you were a noble, your children, and of course then when merchants become wealthy, their children too, since they pay for it, your children of a wealthy merchant or a noble would likely be educated in very basic things, reading and writing, basically, by the local priest. The local priest, who was assumed to be competent at reading and writing, generally by the High Middle Ages they were, would educate them on some very basic stuff. Some basic catechism for the church, some basic reading and writing, elementary things, maybe some basic ciphering, some very elementary mathematics, addition, subtraction, and so on. Okay. Now, Probably not, though, because, well, they would do it by ciphering, which is not... I'll talk about Arabic numerals and where they were used later. Anyway, the point is, if you needed more education, you could then go to... So when the priest taught you, it was called the parish school. That is to say, a priest is responsible in the medieval church and the modern day Catholic Church organization is responsible for a parish. This is the jurisdiction of a priest. A cathedral is kind of like the regional headquarters, and the bishop oversees a number of parishes or a number of priests. And the cathedral is the seat of a bishop's power. A cathedral isn't just a big church. It has an official thing. It's where the bishop works. So you could go to the cathedral school. Now, because cathedrals were important administrative centers, they usually had a number of priests who lived and worked at the cathedral, but who were not individually responsible for a parish. That is to say, they were priests, but their whole job was administrative at the cathedral level. And among the jobs they had, sometimes were educating people who were planning to become priests so that they could go on and assume their duties and do them properly. And since they already had this school system set up, many cathedrals, probably most, brought in extra money by educating the children of nobles and then later wealthy merchants. And they would build on the elementary education provided by the parish school. They would build on that elementary education, and they would sort of extend it further, and you would be educated in sort of a general course of study derived from the old Roman course of study, the trivium, the quadrivium, and you learn about speaking, you learn, a little bit of history as they understood it, a little bit of natural philosophy as they understood it, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so you first go to a school very close to where you live, maybe even right in the same neighborhood where you live, to learn the basics, your elementary education. That should sound familiar. Then after you're finished with that, you go on to a school maybe slightly further from where you live that serves a wider area, and you learn a bit more in the way of complicated subjects. That should also sound familiar. Now, the way they conceived of this was that your elementary education, the parish school was elementary education, or what we might call elementary school. And the cathedral school was what they called secondary education, the thing you do next, the secondary education. And it wasn't necessary, but it was considered good to have. Now, we use secondary education as our term for high school. And you can see the connections, right? It's very similar to the function the parish schools used, or the cathedral schools had. The innovation of the late 11th century in education was the development of what was called the university. And it was originally intended to educate priests to make sure they could do their job. Now, why would they need any more education than was provided already? Well, as I said, it was already recognized that the church was becoming, in a sense, a public institution, a kind of temporal political power in itself that was separate from and could even exercise power over the feudal arrangement of society and could influence the shape of it. This was evidenced by Urban's call for crusade and other things. So some in the church felt that priests needed to have sort of the most up-to-date education because they were, in essence, functionaries of a government. This echoes back, or this is an echo of, rather, the Roman idea that the senators and the people who were at the top of the Roman government needed to be highly educated individuals, not soldiers. They didn't care about that. They wanted them to know literature and philosophy, and to know history, to know all of that stuff, and be able to think about problems. So the university was formed to do this, to provide a liberal education, that is to say, a very wide or free education. Not free monetarily, mind you. They charged a lot of money. And it was originally intended for priests, as was understood by the fact that when you enrolled in the university, you had to take what were called lay orders. You took some vows that made you not a priest or a monk, but something sort of, you were in the church, right? You just weren't like all the way in the church. But you were a member of the church, and students at universities were not subject to civil law. They were subject to canon law. In other words, if they did something wrong, they had to be tried by the church, not by the local feudal authorities. That's another sign, by the way, the existence of canon law and the canon courts. That is definitely a sign that the church was not only a public institution and one that relied on a rule of law rather than the whims of the guy with the sword, but that it was an institution that was separate from the feudal order per se. Anyway, universities. So who taught, and why are they called universities? Well, the idea was that they would be sort of universal in scope, rather than relying on the talents of a single parish priest and whatever he knew, or the talents of one or two canons, which say priests who worked at the cathedral in an administrative capacity. They would bring together scholars who studied various disparate subjects, and they would form them into groups, like study groups, basically, where they could talk to each other and sort of help each other with their studies. These groups were named for the Latin name for a group of people, not even scholars necessarily, but a group of people with a common purpose, and that name was a collegium. The groups, in other words, were the colleges. The college of, if you look at four-year universities, they have the College of Arts and Sciences, the College of Business, the College of Education. What is that? That goes all the way back to our medieval roots, man. These are collegia, and each college is a collegium, a collection of scholars with a common interest and a common purpose. You could enroll in the university by taking the orders and paying the tuition. They didn't offer on-campus housing at the time, and there were very rarely dedicated buildings. The money that the university collected would be used to rent rooms for scholars to deliver lessons in. You would buy your books, you would go to your lessons, or not. There are many stories of students who spent their time hanging out in bars and drinking rather than going to lessons. It's in tight, so nothing much changes. But you could go to your lessons and then go go away from that to debate what you learned with your fellow students or the other scholars. And you do that for 4 years, expected, right? It wasn't a strict course of study, because there is an upside and a downside here. There's the part where I say that there were no exams or tests or papers or homework, and everyone goes, yay! And then I tell you the other bit, the other shoe drops, which is that when you felt you were ready, which was expected to take about 4 years, you would apply to graduate with your baccalaureate degree or your Bachelor of Arts, Bachelorum in Arts. You would, Bachelor in Arts. You would apply to graduate. And in order to graduate, you had to go in and stand in front of the assembled faculty, and they would ask you questions, any questions relating to any of the stuff that you should have been learning all 4 years, and they would do it all day. And, you would have a chance to defend your answers. Like, if you gave an answer and they're like, I don't know, that doesn't sound right, you could debate with them on it and try to convince them, but ultimately, at the end of the day, you either passed or you didn't. So, I don't know, would you trade that, right? Would you want to say, hey, no tests, no homework, no nothing for 4 years, but then they get to ask me anything, right? From my speech class, biology class, humanities class, anything I'm studying. And I have to do it like all day. I don't think a lot of people would take that deal. Anyway, so if you passed, you were a university graduate. And it was expected that you would then take full orders and become a priest. It was kind of like ROTC. You finish 4 years of ROTC and you go into the military. That was the expectation. But a lot of people who graduated from the university did not do that. Which kind of surprised, I guess, the church at first. They were like, why are so many people bothering to get an education that we specifically designed for priests? They didn't get it. They didn't get that the merchant class in particular, which also did not fit into the feudal order, saw a value in an education that was based on a humanistic understanding of the world, and that would be useful in establishing public institutions and displacing the power of the military class that ruled everything. So that happened. So how did universities help unravel the medievalness of Europe in the High Middle Ages? Well, I think I just gave away the game, right? The concept of the university and the liberal education was founded in humanism. It was founded in this idea that we could know and control our universe. Humans are important. And it lent itself well to a social organization based on public institutions and the rule of law, right? With a common educational background between the literate and educated people of Europe, they could begin to form the concept of these impersonal institutions, right? Rather than the whims of individuals to whom they have bound themselves in feudal vassalage. The church was already using university education to fuel its development as a public institution of sorts that was outside the feudal order, properly speaking. And the merchants used it to accelerate their own development of public institutions in urban environments. In northern Italy, the cities, by the early High Middle Ages, were already self-governing by what were called communes, or basically city councils. And this kind of thing began to spread rapidly across Europe to other cities, so that in an ostensibly feudal society, there were these little islands all over Europe by the middle of the High Middle Ages. There were these little islands all over Europe that were decidedly non-medieval, that were decidedly non-feudal, that lived by the rule of law and had public institutions that executed laws. So it was a very weird development, right? And of course, these things were a threat to the power of the nobility, but the nobles also needed these people because they were rapidly becoming the most wealthy people in Europe. Remember, the wealth that you can extract from land is linearly limited by the amount of land. The wealth that you can extract from trade and artisanship has only a theoretical upper limit. And these people were becoming vastly more wealthy than many of the nobles. So it put the nobles in an awkward position. They did not want this emergence of public institutions and the rule of law, but they could not contest it. They could not contest it with the nobles. I mean, not that they didn't try, but ultimately it was a losing proposition. They couldn't contest the merchants and the artisans because the merchants and the artisans provided all the shit that they wanted to buy and had all the wealth. They tended to borrow money from them. Whereas the church, the other upcoming public institution, they relied on the church for the legitimacy of their rule. If the church withdrew this imprimatur of legitimacy, the people would go batshit. and they would not farm, they would not obey, they would not provide payments of grain and other agricultural products. So, okay. So the university helped accelerate the unraveling of the medieval order. The university would be a key part once we get to the Renaissance, as they begin redistributing all of the classical humanistic works of Rome and Greece, but we'll get to that later. Another element that is not truly medieval, but in fact a subversion of a truly medieval order, is something that it's going to sound a little contradictory, but the idea of chivalry and what was called courtly love. Now, in a previous class, one person said that every time I say courtly love, that she hears it as Courtney Love. And if that helps you remember it, then just picture Courtney Love giving this whole lecture. But whatever works for you. Anyway, I don't know if that helps. Maybe it isn't helpful at all, but whatever. Now, chivalry, of course, is something we still talk about being chivalrous, opening doors for ladies and whatnot. The idea was, back in those days, that the idea of chivalry comes out of southern France and out of the tradition of courtly love that first was cultivated there. In the Dark Ages, or the early part of the Middle Ages, there was no code of conduct, you might say, for a noble. Right? A noble was simply a warrior, and you had to be brave and stuff, but that was that. This idea that nobles, and especially knights, the warrior nobles, had to be faithful to some code of honor of how they should behave in a proper fashion with etiquette and whatnot. In other words, chivalry is an innovation of the courts of Aquitaine. Now, part of this has to do with the personality of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was an extremely powerful. She was a queen. She was married to the King of France and then to the King of England. She owned vast amounts of land in France in her own right. She was an extremely intelligent, powerful, headstrong, influential ruler. If you wanted to get shit done, you needed to be on Eleanor's good side. And that meant that Eleanor's opinion of how things ought to be done could change the culture of an entire region, right? So, in Eleanor's courts, there was a lot of influence in the 12th century from the Muslim tradition of mystical poetry, which had been brought back to Europe partially through contact established during the Crusades. Now, the Muslim tradition of mystical poetry had a lot to say about love. Love, in this tradition of thought, was a pure and wonderful thing. It was a passion of the heart. It was something that you could not ignore. And while they talked a lot about love of God, or Allah as they called him, they felt that this same kind of love was reflected on earth between people. That you could feel this burning, overwhelming desire that would make you mad. You just wanted to be in the presence of your beloved. You wanted to share your experiences with them and your life with them. That love was, that following this kind of passion was in a way to recreate your devotion to God. And it was therefore a very holy act. Now, some of those thoughts about love should sound familiar to you, but they were not familiar to Europeans of most of the Middle Ages, and certainly not in the Roman era. Now, it was understood, the Greeks understood that there were numerous ways of loving people. There was pure physical desire, there was a desire for friendship, the love of family, and so on and so forth. But the Romans, who were very practical people, considered romantic love kind of an inconvenience. Marriage was about forming political and economic and social alliances. And romantic love could get in the way of that. Other kinds of love were considered much more reasonable. Cupid, the son of Aphrodite, as he was understood by the Romans, is traditionally pictured nowadays with a bow and arrow, and he shoots arrows of love into people and makes them fall in love. But if it gives you an idea of what the Romans thought about Cupid and his little activities of making people fall in love, the other weapons that the Romans pictured him carrying were an axe and a whip. Love, romantic love, was not a desirable state to be in. It made you make mistakes. It made you do stupid stuff. It might hold up a marriage that would otherwise be good for you and your family. The Muslim mystic tradition changed all of that. It was highly influential in the south of France for reasons that have to do with both geography and the personality of the ruler. And it morphed into, in European hands, into a philosophy of something called courtly love, which is this idea that regardless of who you're married to, and maybe even in the philosophy of courtly love, being married to someone was actually bad for love, inhibited love, because courtly love happened, it could not flourish in the face of all of the mundanities of day-to-day life shared together, all of the household management and whatnot. I think that's a bit pessimistic, but anyway. This idea that you would feel this burning passion and ardor for someone, and you must pursue it, right? How do you pursue it? Well, the man in the relationship must make big, dramatic gestures. He must bring his beloved gifts that show his devotion. He must do impressive things to get her attention. He must write her poetry and sing her songs. Does any of this sound familiar? Yes. These are the ideas of romantic love that persist in our culture today. And this is where it comes from. It comes from this, man. Ultimately traced back to courtly love in southern France in the High Middle Ages and early High Middle Ages, and then traced from there back to the Muslim mystical tradition of the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries. So courtly love, there was this elaborate kind of game that had to be played, I guess, where you had to do all this stuff. And the beloved, the woman, always the one who was chased, who was the one who was pursued in this scenario, should test her lover and make the person really prove themselves, and can have multiple, people courting her at the same time. But eventually, she should give her heart to one of them who is truly worthy, and then they will have this passionate bond, and there you go. So the thing is, the only thing expected of knights prior to this was to be super good at killing people. That's it. But now, in order to be a knight in Eleanor's court, and especially if you want to be on her good side, which was useful because she was super rich and super politically powerful, you needed to clean up nice and learn to dance and write poetry and sing songs. You needed to smell good. Damn, man, there's all kinds of stuff, right? You had to do the thing. You had to up your game. So that was one shift, right? And how could a knight accommodate this? Well, one way that they could accommodate it is that the knight and the nobles in general were becoming less relevant in warfare, right? Money, wealth, people of professional employment, urban populations that are surplus to the population of people who are farming, professional soldiers, right, were becoming more common. Mercenaries. So the knight was becoming less and less a factor, less and less important on the battlefield. And this was a way of maintaining distinct traditions, a distinct culture that was apart from the peasantry, apart from the merchants, apart from the priests? What is the culture of the noble, and particularly the knight, the armored warrior? Well, if it's not simply to make war, in this case it is to make love, or make courtly love in particular. Along with this, sort of alongside of it, there grows up a body of literature, of songs and poems and so forth that are romantic in orientation. They're basically love songs or stories of lovers and things like that. Previously, the literary traditions have been about heroes who went out and killed shit. And now, it's about lovers and people who make great sacrifices for love and stuff. We still tell those kind of stories. You ever watch the Hallmark movie? Anyway. This tradition of literature became quite popular. Even with the non-nobility, because, let me tell you, it was probably a great relief to the middle class, the artisan and merchant class, and even to the peasants. It was probably a great relief to them that the nobility were thinking about something other than who to stab next, right? That's kind of like, oh, hey, cool. They can do things other than ravage the countryside with murder. Yes, let's encourage this, right? So growing up alongside of this, in that literature, we get some literary intimations of this idea that nobles have an obligation to behave better, to behave in a certain special way that reflects their specialness. Again, this is all down to the fact that their original social function is becoming obviated by the changes in society. So, as the social function of the nobility changes, they grapple for ways to distinguish themselves, and they come up with courtly love, and attendant to that, the code of chivalry. Chivalry comes from the French word cheval, it comes from chevalier. Cheval means horse. Chevalier is a horseman, someone who rides a horse. Obviously, nobles were the ones who rode horses. Right? They had the money to keep horses up. It's expensive. And horses were important in warfare. So, what is the code of the chevaliers? Well, the code of the chevaliers is chivalry. Right? The code of the horseman. The code of the knight. The code, more generally speaking, of the noble. How are they to behave? Be courteous to women. Protect the weak. Be honorable. Keep your word. Don't cheat, blah, blah, blah. All this stuff. All of that stuff would have been laughed at by nobles from the Dark Ages. Nobles from the Dark Ages had one purpose in society: murder the shit out of people that were against them. They sure as hell were not going to commit themselves to a code that restricted their ability to murder the shit out of people who were against them. Right? There's no such thing as fighting dirty. There's only winning and losing. Right? That was the idea when your life is on the line. But when you are a noble who is, let's say, in the latter half, or as we get into the 13th century, or even the latter half of the High Middle Ages, you might never see combat. Right? Yes, technically speaking, you still owe your lord a service, military service. But now that there's a lot more wealth and a lot more coinage, you can purchase a replacement to go in your place. A professional warrior who will serve in your place. Your lord doesn't care because he gets the military service regardless. Someone shows up to fight for him. Awesome. Or you could just pay a tax called a scutage, a shield tax, directly to your lord in exchange for not showing up. In which case, he'll just use it to hire mercenaries himself. Either way. The point is, you could be a noble and very plausibly never fight. Well, if you're doing that, then A, you need to justify your existence, and B, you can afford, rather, to commit yourself to a kind of code of honor that will be very disadvantageous on the battlefield. So, chivalry is actually, rather than being the apotheosis, the sort of highest development of knighthood in Europe, the development of chivalry is the first signs that the knights of Europe are surplus to requirement, that they are not really needed as such. Chivalry would have never developed had they been pure bare knuckles warriors, as they had been in the Dark Ages. They are becoming something else, a hereditary ruling class, no longer based upon warfare. So, okay. Courtly love, the university, two big cultural influences in chivalry, along with courtly love, two big cultural influences that speed up the unraveling of the feudal order as people adopt them, or at the very least are signs of the unraveling of the feudal order. It's kind of all mixed up and hard to say. Are these the results of it or the cause of it? Kind of both. Okay, so I think that's it for this time. Next time we'll talk about sort of the final slide, like the nail in the coffin of the Middle Ages, which is to say the things that finally really put a crimp in the feudal order and sent us into a new way of thinking about society. Okay, have a good one.